Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. Hurricanes, they're a fact of life down here on the Gulf Coast. You learn to respect them, you learn to watch the signs, and you learn to get the heck out of Dodge when they come calling. Most of the time, you get a good few days warning, plenty of time to haul your boat up on blocks, batten down the hatches, and hunker down with some iced tea and wait it out. But this one wasn't like that. This one blew in like a runaway train, sneaky like a thief in the night, and nearly stole my life. It did. It was back. It must have been 98, maybe 99. Can't rightly remember the year, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. Summer was in full swing, hotter than blue blazes, the kind of heat that hangs heavy in the air, makes the cicadas sing louder and slower, and just saps the energy right out of you. But the fishing was good. Oh, Lordy, was it good. Red snapper were biting like crazy, and I was bringing in my limit every trip. Enough to keep the freezer full, sell a bit to old Mrs. Henderson down at the fish market, and still have some left over to share with my neighbors. A good summer, a real good summer. That morning started just like any other. Woke up before the sun. That's the fisherman's way, you know. Got to beat the heat and beat the crowds. Made myself a strong cup of coffee, black as sin and hot as the hinges of hell, and a couple of slices of toast with some homemade fig. Preserves my wife, bless her soul, used to make. She's been gone, well, a good long while now, but her preserves, they still sweeten my mornings. Hopped in my old Ford pickup, that trusty beast, and drove down to the marina. The Salty Dog, that's what I called my boat. A 22-foot Grady White she was. Not fancy, not new, but solid as a rock, and seaworthy as they come. She'd seen me through a lot, that boat. We were partners, me and the Salty Dog. Always looked after each other. Got down to the dock. The air was still cool then, just starting to get that humid edge to it. The sky was clear as a bell, not a cloud in sight. Sun just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Sea was flat calm, like a sheet of glass reflecting the dawn. Perfect fishing weather. Couldn't have asked for better. I untied her lines, fired up the engine, that old reliable purr, and idled out of the no-wake zone. Headed out towards my favorite snapper spot, about 30 miles offshore. Out there you get away from the crowds, and the fish are always bigger. Tastier too, I swear. The trip out was smooth as butter, just the gentle rocking of the boat, the smell of salt air, and the sound of the engine humming. Seagulls crying overhead, dolphins playing in the wake. Days like that, you feel like you're living in a postcard, like nothing could ever go wrong. Got to my spot, dropped anchor, and got to work. Baited my hooks with some squid, dropped my lines, and bam, almost instant bite. Pulled up a nice chunky red snapper, bright red and feisty as could be. Grinned like a fool. This was going to be a good day, I thought. And it was for a while. Fish were jumping in the boat. The sun was climbing higher, warming my back, and I was whistling along to some old country tune on the radio. Felt like I was on top of the world, Had about half my limit in the cooler already, and it wasn't even 10 in the morning. Then things started to change. Subtle at first, like a whisper in the wind before the storm. I noticed the wind picking up a little. Just a slight breeze, hardly anything to worry about. But it felt different, colder somehow, and it shifted direction. Started coming from the north, which was unusual for that time of year. Normally the summer winds blow in off the Gulf, warm and moist. Looked up at the sky, still blue overhead, but towards the north, over the land. There was a haze starting to gather, kind of a grayish, yellowish haze. Didn't look like rain clouds, not yet. More like something brewing. Ignored it for a bit. Figured it was just some afternoon thunderstorms rolling in early. Happens sometimes. But the wind kept picking up, and the haze was getting thicker, darker. The sea, which had been so calm, started to get a little chop to it. Just little whitecaps, but still. The radio started acting funny. Static creeping in, drowning out the music. Tried switching channels, see if I could get a weather report. Nothing but static and garbled voices. That's when a little prickle of unease started to creep up my spine. Then the birds went quiet. Seagulls stopped crying, just disappeared. Dolphins vanished too. The whole ocean seemed to hold its breath. And the wind. Lord, that wind was starting to howl now. No longer a breeze. This was a proper wind, pushing the boat around, making it harder to hold my position. Looked up at the sky again. The haze had swallowed up the blue. The whole sky was this sickly gray-yellow color now, and it was moving fast, rushing in from the north like a freight train. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a thunderstorm. This was something else, something bad. Hurricane, I said out loud to myself, the word catching in my throat. Couldn't believe it. Hurricanes don't just pop up like this, not without warning. We always get days to prepare. But looking at that sky, feeling that wind, I knew, in my gut. This was a hurricane, and it was coming right for me. Panic started to set in, but I pushed it down. Years of fishing, years of dealing with rough seas, kicked in. Had to stay calm, had to think. First thing, haul anchor. Couldn't stay anchored in this. Boat would get swamped for sure. Started cranking that anchor winch. Wind was screaming now. Rain starting to spit, stinging my face. Waves were getting bigger, choppier, tossing the boat around like a cork. Took forever to get that anchor up, felt like. Every muscle in my arms screaming. Finally got it aboard, stowed it as best I could, and scrambled back to the helm. Engine roaring now, pointed the boat into the wind, trying to keep her steady. Needed to head back to shore, and fast. But shore felt 1,000,000 miles away. The storm hit then, not gradually, not with a slow build-up, just bam, like a giant fist slamming down on the ocean. Wall of rain hit first, blinding, torrential. Couldn't see a thing. Then the wind, a solid wall of air, like hitting a brick wall at full speed. Knocked the breath right out of me. Waves exploded around the boat, huge monstrous things, rising up like mountains, then crashing down with a roar. The salty dog was tossed around like a toy, up one wave, down another, sideways, every which way, but loose, lost all sense of direction. Just hanging on for dear life, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, fighting to keep the boat pointed into the waves. Engine screaming, straining, but barely making headway against the wind and waves. Rain was coming down so hard, it was like being underwater, even above deck. Couldn't see, couldn't hear, just the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and the shuddering of the boat. Thought for sure she was going to break apart. Right then and there. Waves kept getting bigger, meaner. 1 minute I was staring up at a wall of water 20 feet high. The next I was plunging down into a trough so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Water was pouring over the sides, filling the cockpit. Bilge pump was working overtime, but it was a losing battle. Tried to call for help on the radio again, but it was useless. Just static and crackling. Lost contact with everyone. Alone out there in the middle of the storm. Just me and the salty dog against the full fury of nature. Time lost all meaning. Could have been hours. Could have been minutes. Felt like an eternity. Just fighting, struggling, trying to survive. Every wave felt like it was going to be the one to flip the boat, to send me to the bottom. Fear was a constant companion, gnawing at my insides, whispering that this was the end. Remember looking out through the driving rain and seeing something big and dark looming through the waves. Thought it was another monstrous wave, but then it got closer, and I realized it was a ship, a big cargo ship, wallowing in the storm, just as helpless as I was, but a whole lot bigger. Scared me even more seeing that thing. Made me realize just how small I was, how insignificant, out here in the face of this storm, like an ant facing a bulldozer. Kept fighting, kept trying to steer, kept pumping the bilge, kept praying, prayed to God, prayed to my wife, prayed to anyone who might be listening, just begging for it to stop, begging for a break. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it started to ease. Wind didn't howl quite so loud. Rain didn't fall quite so hard. Waves, still big, still rough, but not quite so monstrous. Like the storm was taking a breath. Held my breath too, not daring to believe it, but it kept easing. Wind died down a bit more. Rain turned to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. Clouds started to break up, and through the gaps I saw blue sky. Just patches of it, but blue sky nonetheless. Sun even peeked through for a moment, weak and watery. But still, the sun. Felt like I hadn't seen the sun in days, or maybe it had only been hours. Didn't matter. The storm was passing. The sea was still a mess, waves still big and confused. But the worst was over. Engine was still running, thank God. Boat was battered, bruised, cockpit full of water, but she was afloat. We'd made it. We'd survived. Sat there for a long time after the storm passed, just catching my breath, letting the adrenaline drain away, shaking like a leaf, cold and wet and exhausted, but alive. That was all that mattered. Alive. Slowly, cautiously, I turned the salty dog toward shore. Trip back was slow, careful. Waves were still kicking up, and the boat was riding low with all the water in it. But the sun was coming out stronger now, warming my face, drying my clothes. Saw other boats out there, coming out of hiding, blinking in the sunlight like newborn calves. Everyone looking around, taking stock of the damage, the aftermath. We'd all been through it. We'd all survived. Finally limped back into port. Folks were there on the docks, waiting, worried, sick. Saw my buddy, old Billy, waving his arms, yelling my name. He ran down as I tied up, face all pale and drawn. "Jerry, you all right? We thought you were a goner." I just grinned, weak and shaky, and said, "Like a bad penny, Billy. Always turn up again." He slapped me on the back hard enough to make me cough, but it felt good. Felt good to be back on solid ground, felt good to be alive, felt good to be among friends. Later we found out what happened. That storm, they called it a freak storm, formed out of nowhere, strengthened over warm water in record time, and slammed into the coast with hardly any warning. Caught everyone by surprise. Some folks weren't so lucky. Lost boats, lost homes. Some even lost their lives. But me and the salty dog, we made it. Learned a lesson that day, let me tell you. Respect the sea. Always respect the sea. You think you know it. You think you've seen it all. And then something like that comes along and reminds you just how small you really are. Still go fishing, you know. Can't keep an old fisherman away from the water, but I'm a whole lot more careful now. I watch the skies, I listen to the weather reports, and if there's even a whisper of trouble, I head for shore. Ain't no fish worth going through that again, not for all the tea in China. I was just sitting here, remembering another time out on the water, and I figured, why keep it to myself? Let me tell you all about it. Ah, yes, there was that time, down on the Black River, back in, oh lordy, must have been around 88, maybe 89. Time flies faster than a hummingbird in heat, I'm telling you. Now the Black River. Beautiful place it is, or was back then. Still pretty now, I reckon, but different. Things always change, don't they? Anyway, back then, the Black River was wilder, less touched, you could say, especially down past the old paper mill. Now that paper mill, that's important to this story. It wasn't the cleanest operation, not by a long shot. They used to dump all sorts of, well, let's just say things you wouldn't want swimming in, right into the river. Folks around here, we knew it, but back then, nobody said much. Jobs were jobs, you know. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and keep fishing. And fish I did. Black River catfish were legendary. Big, meaty, tasty. Well, most of them were. I had my favorite spot, a little bend in the river, about 3 miles downstream from the mill. Deep hole there, with a big old cypress tree leaning over the water, roots all tangled in the bank. Perfect catfish hangout. I used to go there every chance I got, early mornings mostly, when the river was still misty and quiet, just the sound of the water and the birds waking up. Peaceful, calm, just what an old fisherman needs. Now usually, I'd catch your regular run-of-the-mill catfish there. Blues, channels, maybe a flathead if I was lucky. Good size, maybe a couple of pounds to 10, 15 on a really good day. Enough for supper, and maybe a little extra to sell down at the market. But one day was different. It was a day just like today, actually. Warm, sunny, little breeze kicking up. I got to my spot just as the sun was peeking over the trees, making the river sparkle like it was sprinkled with diamonds. Perfect fishing weather, I thought to myself. I baited up my line with some chicken liver. Catfish just can't resist that stuff, and cast it out into the deep hole under that cypress. And I waited. Now fishing ain't just about catching fish, you know. It's about the waiting, the thinking, the watching the world go by. It's therapy, pure and simple. Just me, the river, and the quiet of nature. I was leaning back against that cypress, closing my eyes, just listening to the river gurgle by, when bam, my pole nearly jumped right out of my hands. Now, I've had big catfish hit my line before, but this was different. This wasn't no gentle tug. This was like hooking into a runaway train. My reel was screaming, line peeling off like it was on fire. I grabbed that pole tight, braced myself against the bank, and set the hook hard. Whatever was on the other end of that line, it was big, really big. The fight was on, and boy, what a fight it was. This fish pulled and tugged, dove deep, ran sideways, everything it could to get away. It was like fighting an underwater tractor. I'm telling you, my arms were aching, my back was creaking, sweat was beading up on my forehead. But I wasn't about to give up, not after a hit like that. I've been fishing too long to back down from a challenge. Now usually, when you're fighting a big fish, you can kind of feel what it is, the way it pulls, the way it shakes its head. You get a sense of whether it's a catfish, a bass, a carp, whatever. But this was something else. It felt different, heavier, stronger, angrier somehow. And the longer I fought it, the more uneasy I started to feel. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 20 minutes, I started to gain some ground. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to crank that reel, pulling the fish up from the depths. And then I saw it. It surfaced about 50 feet out, thrashing and splashing like a wounded whale. And that's when I got my first good look at it. And let me tell you, my jaw nearly dropped to the riverbank. It was a catfish, all right. No doubt about that. But it wasn't like any catfish I'd ever seen in my life. This thing was, well, it was glowing. Not like a light bulb, mind you, but a faint, greenish, sickly sort of glow, especially around its whiskers and its fins and its eyes. Lord have mercy. Its eyes were like two red coals burning in the murky water. And the size of it, it was huge. I mean, truly monstrous. I reckon it was at least 4 feet long, maybe 5, and as thick as a log. Its skin wasn't the usual catfish color either. It was patchy, almost like it was molting, with these strange, pale, almost translucent areas mixed in with the normal, dark brown. And it had growths, lumpy, fleshy growths all along its back and sides, looking like tumors or something. It was something straight out of a horror movie, I tell you. What in the Sam Hill? I muttered to myself, reeling it in closer, but now a lot slower, a lot more cautious. I was no longer thinking about supper. Now I was just thinking about survival. This wasn't no ordinary fish. This was something else entirely. As I got it closer to the bank, I could smell it. A strange, metallic, almost chemical smell, mixed with the usual fishy river scent. And I started to put two and two together. The paper mill, the strange glow, the growths, the size. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a big catfish. This was a mutant, a radioactive mutant, most likely, thanks to all that stuff they were dumping in the river upstream. Now, I'm no scientist. I'm just a simple fisherman. But I knew enough to know that radiation ain't good. And this fish, well, it looked like it had been marinating in the stuff for years. My heart started thumping in my chest like a drum solo. Fear, real fear, started to creep into my bones. But you know what? Underneath the fear, there was also curiosity. Yeah, curious. I know, sounds crazy, right? Here I am, face to face with some kind of glow-in-the-dark monster fish, and I'm curious. But that's just how I am, I guess. Always been a bit of a curious soul, and maybe a little bit reckless too, or maybe just plain foolish. Take your pick. Anyway, I got it right up to the edge of the bank. It was still thrashing weakly, its red eyes glaring up at me. I could see its teeth now, long and sharp, looking like they could bite right through a steel cable. I knew I couldn't bring it in the boat. No way. That thing was too dangerous, too unnatural. So, what did I do? Well, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for my pliers, the ones I always carry to unhook fish, and I decided I was going to cut the line. Let it go. Let it go back to whatever dark radioactive depths it came from. Some fish just ain't meant to be caught. And this was definitely one of them. But just as I was about to cut the line, something happened. The fish, it stopped thrashing. It just went still, and its red eyes, they seemed to soften somehow, almost like it was looking at me, not in an angry way, but almost like it was asking for help. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jerry, you imagine things. It's just a fish. But I swear to you, son, that's what it felt like. It felt like this mutant catfish, this creature of the radioactive river, was looking at me with understanding, with maybe even a little bit of sadness. And in that moment, something changed in me. The fear, it faded away, replaced by pity, I guess, and maybe a little bit of guilt. Guilt that we humans, we had done this to this creature, turned it into this freak of nature. So I didn't cut the line. Instead, I did something even crazier. I gently, carefully reached down and unhooked it. Yeah, I know. Sounds insane. Reaching down and unhooking a glowing mutant radioactive catfish. But I did it. Slowly, calmly, just like I was unhooking any other fish. Except this time my hands were shaking like leaves in a hurricane. And you know what? It let me. It didn't bite, didn't thrash, didn't even move. It just lay there, still as a stone, while I worked the hook free. And when I finally got it out, I just let go of the line and watched. The catfish, it just lay there for a moment, floating in the water. Then, slowly, almost deliberately, it turned its head and looked at me one more time. Those red eyes, they seemed to flicker like a dying ember. And then, with a slow, powerful flick of its tail, it vanished, sunk back down into the dark depths of the Black River. Gone. I stood there for a long time, watching the ripples fade away, just trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Had I imagined it? Had it been a hallucination, brought on by the sun and the heat? Or had I really just wrestled with, and then released, a radioactive mutant catfish? I don't know for sure. Maybe it was just the biggest catfish I ever caught, and my mind just played tricks on me, made it into something it wasn't. But I don't think so. I think deep down, I know what I saw that day, and I know why I let it go. I packed up my gear that day and walked back to my truck, a lot quieter than when I'd arrived. Didn't catch another fish that day. Didn't even want to. Just drove home and sat on this porch, just like I'm sitting now, looking out at the lake and thinking. I never went back to that spot on the Black River. Not after that. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that catfish. Is it still down there, glowing in the dark, getting bigger and stranger with each passing year? Or did it not make it? Did the radiation finally catch up to it? I don't know. And maybe it's better that way. Some things are best left a mystery. But I'll tell you one thing, son. That day on the Black River, it changed me. Made me think differently about things. About the river. About the fish. About us. About what we do to this world. And what it does to us in return. So, there you have it. The tale of the radioactive mutant catfish of the Black River. A true story? Well, that's for you to decide. But I swear, every word of it is as true as I remember it. And in the end, maybe that's all that matters, eh? The memory of it, the feeling of it, the lesson of it, maybe. Y'all hang tight. I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back. And when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. It must have been, late 80s, maybe early 90s. Yeah, early 90s, I reckon. I was younger then, of course. Stronger, quicker. Still had all my hair then, too, though it was probably already starting to think about turning gray. Debbie and I, we were just getting settled into this place, and I was fishing like a man possessed. Didn't have the responsibility of running the cabin back then. Just me, the boat, and the open water. Pure freedom, that was. Now, you got to understand, back then, the fishing was different. Not better, not worse, just different. Regulations weren't as tight, and the fish, well, they seemed a little bigger, a little bolder maybe. Or maybe it was just me being younger and thinking everything was bigger back then. Could be that too. Anyway, I had this boat back then, a 23-foot Grady White. She was a beauty, that boat. The salty dog, I called her. Solid as a rock. Could handle anything the Gulf threw at her. I spent more time on that boat than I did on dry land some weeks, I swear. Used to head out before sunrise, come back long after dark, sometimes even stay out overnight if the fishing was good. Debbie, she'd worry herself sick sometimes, but she knew it was in my blood. Fishing, that is. It's more than just a hobby for me. It's part of who I am. Like breathing air or feeling the sun on your face. So this particular trip, I was heading out for grouper. Now grouper, they're a bottom fish. Big, strong, delicious eating, and a real challenge to catch. They live down deep, around reefs and wrecks, anywhere they can find cover. They're ambush predators, you see. Lurk in the shadows, wait for a tasty snack to swim by, and then bam, they're on it. And once they're hooked, they'll head straight back down into their hole, try to break you off on the rocks or the wreck. You gotta be quick, gotta be strong, and gotta be smart to catch a big grouper. I had a spot I'd been fishing for years, about 30 miles offshore, an old sunken shrimp boat, down in maybe 80 feet of water. I'd caught some good fish there before, but nothing prepared me for what was waiting for me that day. The morning dawned crisp and clear, just the way I like it. Sunrise painting the sky in oranges and pinks. The air still cool and salty. The Gulf was almost flat calm, just a gentle swell rolling in. Perfect grouper weather, as we say. I had my gear all loaded up, my favorite heavy tackle rod and reel, spooled with strong braided line, and a cooler full of ice and bait. Mullet was the bait of choice that day. Nice and oily. Grouper can't resist it. I got out to the spot just as the sun was climbing above the horizon. Used my GPS, fancy stuff for back then, but it was a lifesaver, to pinpoint the wreck. Dropped anchor up current, letting the boat drift back over the spot. I like to fish with live bait when I can, but mullet chunks work just fine too, especially for grouper. I rigged up a heavy jig head, hooked a nice chunk of mullet on it, and dropped it down. Now, grouper fishing. It's not like trolling for mackerel or casting for redfish. It's mostly waiting. You drop your bait down, let it sink to the bottom, and then you just wait, feel for the bite. Sometimes it's a subtle tap, tap, tap. Other times it's like a freight train hitting your line. You never really know. I let my bait sink down, felt it thud against the bottom, reeled up a couple of cranks to keep it just off the seabed, and then I waited. The gentle rocking of the boat, the sound of the waves lapping against the hull, the cries of the gulls overhead. It's a peaceful sort of waiting. Let you clear your head, think about things, or not think about anything at all. Just be present in the moment. After maybe 10 minutes, I felt a little twitch on my line, just a tiny little tug, like a nibble. Could have been a small snapper, could have been a trigger fish, could have been anything. I ignored it. Sometimes those little fish just mess with your bait. You got to wait for the real deal. Then a few minutes later, another twitch. This time, a bit more insistent, like something was sniffing around, getting interested. My heart started to beat a little faster. Grouper? Maybe. Just maybe. I held my breath, my hand gripping the rod tight, feeling every vibration of the line. And then it happened. Wham! It was like the bottom of the ocean just exploded. The rod bent over double. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. This wasn't no little snapper. This was something big. Real big. Whoa! I yelled out loud, more to myself than anything else. Hang on tight, Jerry. The fish was pulling drag like crazy, heading straight down towards the wreck. I knew what it was trying to do. It was trying to get back into its hole, to rub the line against the sharp edges of the wreckage and break me off. If it made it down there, it would be game over. I tightened the drag on my reel as much as I dared. Didn't want to break the line, but I couldn't let it get down to the wreck either. It was a delicate balance. The rod was bowed almost to the breaking point. My arms were straining, my knuckles white as bone. This fish was strong, unbelievably strong. Stronger than any grouper I'd ever tangled with before, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. It was a straight up and down battle. Me against the fish, brute strength against brute strength. I was slowly, agonizingly gaining line. Inch by inch, foot by foot, I was pulling it up from the depths. But every foot I gained, it felt like it fought me back with two. My arms were burning, my back was aching, sweat was pouring down my face, even in the cool morning air. But I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not with a fish like this on the line. This was the kind of fish you dream about. The kind of fish that makes all those hours of waiting, all those empty trips, all worthwhile. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the screaming of the reel started to slow. The line angle started to change, pointing more towards the surface. I was gaining ground. I could feel the fish tiring just a little. Or maybe it was me who was tiring. I couldn't tell anymore. I kept pumping and reeling, slowly but surely bringing the fish up. My muscles were screaming. My hands were cramping, but adrenaline was coursing through my veins, keeping me going. I had to see this fish. I had to know what was on the end of that line. And then it started, a faint shimmer, deep down in the green water, a flash of white, and then slowly, majestically it began to rise. Bigger and bigger it grew as it came up from the depths. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was no ordinary grouper. This was a monster. It broke the surface with a swirl of white water, and I finally got my first real look at it. It was a gag grouper, and it was enormous, bigger than any grouper I had ever seen or even heard of. Its body was thick as a barrel, its mouth like a bucket, its eyes cold and ancient. It looked like something out of a prehistoric age. I just stared at it, awestruck. For a moment, I almost forgot I was still hooked up to it. It was just magnificent, truly magnificent. But the fight wasn't over yet. The fish was still plenty strong, and it was still angry. It thrashed at the surface, sending spray flying, trying to shake the hook. I knew I had to get it alongside the boat, and fast, before it found a second wind, or before the hook pulled loose. Slowly, carefully, I worked it towards the boat. It was like trying to maneuver a small truck. Every move was deliberate. Every inch gained was hard fought. Finally, after what seemed like another eternity, I had it alongside. And that's when I realized I didn't have a net big enough. I didn't have a gaff big enough. Heck, I probably didn't have anything on board that was big enough to handle this fish. I was in trouble. I circled the fish, trying to figure out what to do. It was just lying there on the surface, its massive gills pumping, its dark eyes staring at me. It was exhausted, just like I was, but I knew it could still summon up a last burst of energy if it needed to. Then I had an idea, a crazy idea maybe, but it was the only one I had. I grabbed my heavy leader material, the stuff I used to make my bottom rigs, and tied a loop in the end, a big, strong loop. Then carefully, slowly, I leaned over the side of the boat, my heart pounding in my throat. I had to get that loop around the fish's tail. That was the only way I was going to get it into the boat. But getting close enough to that monstrous mouth, well, it made my skin crawl, just thinking about it. Taking a deep breath, I reached out with the loop. The fish didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was like it knew what I was trying to do. Slowly, carefully, inch by inch, I maneuvered the loop toward its tail. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the line. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the loop around its tail. Gently, I tightened it. Snug, but not too tight. I didn't want to hurt the fish, and I didn't want to spook it. Then, with a grunt and every ounce of strength I had left, I started to haul. It was like trying to lift a bag of cement out of the water. My muscles screamed. My back protested. My arms felt like they were going to rip out of their sockets. But I kept pulling. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to lift the fish's tail out of the water, then its body, then its massive head. It was a struggle, a desperate back-breaking struggle, but I was winning. Finally, with a last Herculean heave, I managed to swing the fish up and over the gunwale of the boat. It landed on the deck with a thud that shook the whole boat. And then it was done. It was in the boat. I had done it. I collapsed back against the console, gasping for breath, my body trembling, my hands shaking. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the fish, at this magnificent creature I had just wrestled from the depths. It was even bigger on deck than it had looked in the water. Truly a monster. After a few minutes, when my breathing started to return to normal, I got up and went over to the fish. It was still alive, its gills still pumping, but it was exhausted just like I was. I knelt down beside it and just looked at it, really looked at it, at its thick, powerful body, its ancient eyes, its massive mouth. It was a creature of the deep, a king of its domain, and I had, for a brief moment, matched wits with it and come out on top. A strange feeling washed over me. Pride, of course, but also respect and a little bit of sadness. Sadness that such a magnificent creature was now out of its element, out of its world. Sadness that its life, which had probably spanned decades, maybe even centuries, was now going to end. I knew I couldn't release it. Not after such a long fight. It was too exhausted, too stressed. It wouldn't survive. And besides, back then, regulations weren't what they are now. Catching a fish like this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was a trophy, a story to tell for years to come. So with a heavy heart, but with a sense of awe and respect, I dispatched the grouper. It was quick and as humane as I could make it. Then I set about the task of getting it into the fish box. Even that was a struggle. It barely fit. I had to really cram it in there, and even then the tail was sticking out. The trip back to shore was, well, it was different. The boat felt heavier, more solid somehow, like it was carrying something truly significant. The sun was higher now. The day was getting hotter, but I hardly noticed. My mind was still back there, in the depths, battling that fish. When I got back to the dock, there were a few other fishermen around, cleaning their catches. As I pulled up, they all stopped what they were doing and stared. They saw the size of the fish in my boat, and their jaws just dropped. "Holy moly, Jerry, what in the world did you catch?" One of them asked, his eyes wide. "Grouper," I said, my voice still a little hoarse from yelling. "A big one." They came over to take a look, and a small crowd started to gather. Everyone was amazed. They'd never seen a grouper that big, never even heard of one that big. Word spread around the docks like wildfire. People came from all over, just to see it. We weighed it on the dock scales. It tipped the scales at, well, let's just say it was well over 100 pounds. Closer to 150 if I'm being honest. A true monster grouper. That fish, well, it fed us for weeks, and we shared it with all our friends and neighbors. It was the talk of the town for months. People still ask me about it sometimes, even now. "Jerry, remember that giant grouper you caught back in the day?" They always ask. And I always smile and say, "Yeah, I remember." How could I forget? Because you don't forget a fish like that. It's not just about the size, although that was impressive, sure. It's about the fight, the struggle, the connection you make with nature, with the raw power of the ocean. Y'all hang tight. I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back, and when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. The wind carried the scent of salt and adventure as I stood on the dock, staring out at the sea that had been my companion for over 45 years. The morning was young, the sky a soft shade of dawn pink, and the water stretched endless before me. Eleanor, my trusty boat, bobbed gently with the tide, ready as always for another journey. Something deep in my bones told me this trip would be different, though. A gut feeling, the kind a fisherman learns to trust after a lifetime on the water. Debbie stood at the cabin door, arms crossed, a knowing look in her eyes. "You be careful out there, Jerry," she said, her voice carrying that mix of love and mild exasperation. She knew as well as I did that I wouldn't turn back, no matter what the ocean had in store. I kissed her on the forehead, grabbed my gear, and stepped onto Eleanor's deck. The engine rumbled to life beneath me, the sound a comforting promise that she was as ready as I was. The sea was calm at first, an easy ride as I made my way toward deeper waters. The sun climbed higher, warming my back, and the familiar solitude settled in. It was just me and the open water, the only company the occasional gull circling above. I cast my first line, waiting, watching, knowing that patience was the true art of fishing. It started as a subtle tug, a teasing motion that sent a thrill through my fingers. Then suddenly the line pulled hard, nearly yanking the rod from my grip. I planted my feet and reeled in, my muscles straining against the force. Whatever was on the other end was strong, determined, a fighter. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The fish wasn't giving up, and neither was I. The boat rocked as waves crashed against the hull, the fight between man and fish playing out in the heart of the deep. With each pull, I felt the power of the sea, the thrill of the chase, the unspoken respect between predator and prey. At last, the silver body of the fish broke the surface, glistening in the sunlight. A massive tuna, the biggest I had seen in years. I hauled it onto the deck, breathless, victorious. My hands shook with exhaustion, but my heart pounded with satisfaction. This was why I came out here, why I answered the call of the water time and time again. The sky darkened too quickly, the air thick with the scent of an approaching storm. I had seen enough storms to know this one wasn't going to be gentle. The waves grew restless, slamming against Eleanor's sides. I needed to head back before it was too late. Lightning split the sky, followed by the deafening roar of thunder. Rain pelted down in sheets, blinding me as I fought to steer Eleanor through the chaos. The boat lurched, nearly tipping as the waves swelled around me. My grip on the wheel tightened, knuckles white as I battled the sea's fury. For hours I wrestled against the storm, every inch of my body screaming with effort. The world was reduced to darkness and crashing water. I had been through rough seas before, but this was something else. The ocean had turned against me, and I was at her mercy. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm's rage softened. A strange stillness settled over the water, an eerie calm. I took a deep breath, shaking, soaked to the bone, but the battle wasn't over yet. The storm had passed, but I was left adrift. The sea stretched endlessly around me, and I had lost my bearings. My radio was silent, my compass spinning wildly. I needed to find my way home. The ocean, calm as it seemed, held unseen dangers. Strange shadows moved beneath the surface, and I knew that I was not alone. The deep had its own rules, and I was just another traveler passing through. Supplies were running low. The fresh water I had brought was nearly gone, and my stomach growled with an ache I tried to ignore. I cast my line again, hoping for another catch, something to keep me going. Night fell, bringing with it an unfamiliar loneliness. The stars above were my only company, their silent glow a reminder of how small I was in the vastness of the world. I whispered a prayer to Debbie, hoping she wasn't too worried. Morning brought a sliver of hope. A seabird landed on my deck, a sign that land wasn't far. My heart surged with renewed determination. I adjusted my course, following the bird's path. As the sun rose higher, a shape emerged from the mist. An old wreck, half sunk, drifting aimlessly. I approached cautiously, wondering what stories it held, what sailors had once called it home. Far on the horizon, a light flickered. A ship, a lighthouse. I couldn't be sure, but I set my course toward it, my spirit lifting with each passing moment. The waves grew rough again, testing my resolve. I gritted my teeth and pushed forward, the promise of safety driving me through the hardships. Land. At last I saw it, a thin line on the horizon, growing larger with each minute. My heart pounded. I was almost home. As I pulled into the dock, Debbie was there, waiting. She ran to me, her eyes filled with relief. "Took your time, didn't you?" she said, smiling through her worry. I laughed, pulling her close. The sea had tested me, but I had made it back. And as long as I had strength left in my body, I knew I would return to its call again. I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. Now I was probably, maybe 55, 56 years old at the time. Still had a good bit of salt left in my beard, but the years were starting to show. But my boat, the Sea Serpent, she was still chugging along, faithful as ever. I'd had her for over 30 years, and she knew the waters of the Gulf of Mexico better than I knew the back of my hand. It was a scorcher of a July morning, the kind that makes the air shimmer like a mirage. The sun was already beaten down hard by 6, and the humidity was thick enough you could chew on it. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow as I pulled out of the harbor in Biloxi, the Sea Serpent groaning a little as she got underway. I was after red snapper that day, a good mess of them to sell down at the market. I'd been having decent luck, but I was hoping for a real haul. Bait was fresh, tackle was ready, and I had a cooler full of ice. I was set. I headed out to my usual spot, about 20 miles offshore, where the reef dropped off sharp. The GPS coordinates were burned into my memory after all these years. I eased the anchor down, hooked up my line with some cut mullet, and waited. Regular as clockwork. The snapper started biting. I was pulling him in pretty steady for a couple of hours. Nothing huge, mind you. Mostly 2-3 pounders, but enough to make it worth my while. The sun climbed higher, the air got stickier, and the snapper started to slow down. I figured they'd gone deeper to escape the heat. That's when I decided to change things up. I figured I'd troll around a bit, maybe see if I could snag a king mackerel or two. They like to cruise around those reef edges, chasing bait fish. So I pulled up the anchor, cranked up the engine, and started to motor slowly along the edge of the reef, dragging a couple of lures behind me. Now I'd caught my share of mackerel, and even a few wahoo over the years, but I'd always dreamed of catching a marlin. They were the kings of the Gulf, majestic creatures that could fight like hell. I'd seen pictures, heard stories, but never had one on the line. Honestly, I figured I never would. I was just about to give up on the trolling idea and head back to my original spot when it happened. The reel on my heavy-duty rod, the one I usually used for sharks, started screaming like a banshee. That wasn't no mackerel. That was something big. I grabbed the rod, and the force nearly ripped it out of my hands. Whatever was on the other end was pulling like a freight train. The Sea Serpent started to list to one side as the line screamed off the reel. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Easy does it, Jerry. Don't get too excited." I adjusted the drag, trying to find that sweet spot between letting the fish run and putting too much pressure on the line. I knew that if I clamped down too hard, it would snap. but if I let it run too much, it would spool me. The fight was on. For the first few minutes, all I could do was hold on. This thing was just taking line, heading out to open water like it owned the place. I could feel the power in every jerk and pull. It was an exhilarating, terrifying feeling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fish started to slow down a little. I started to gradually reel in some line, gaining a few feet with each turn of the handle. It was slow, agonizing work. My arms burned, my back ached, and sweat poured down my face. I finally managed to get a little bit of the line back, and then the fish jumped. It breached the surface of the water in a spectacular display of power, silver and black scales glinting in the sunlight. I could see its long, spear-like bill and its massive size. It was a marlin, and not just any marlin. This was a monster. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I whispered. "That's a damn blue one." Now, I knew I was in for a fight. A marlin like that wasn't going to give up easy. I settled in for the long haul, knowing that this could take hours. As I fought the marlin, I started to think about everything I knew about them. I knew they were apex predators, built for speed and power. I knew they were solitary creatures, roaming the oceans in search of food. I knew they were a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the sea. I also knew that they were in trouble. Overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction were threatening their survival. It made me think about what I was doing too. Here I am, this old man trying to catch one of these things. I started to question myself. Should I really be doing this? Was it worth the risk? To the fish? To myself? Just for the thrill of the fight? But then the marlin would surge again, pulling me back to the present moment, back to the battle. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on what I was doing. Hour after hour, the fight went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat grew more intense, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. But I refused to give up. I was determined to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. Sometimes the marlin would run, taking out hundreds of yards of line. Other times it would sound, diving deep into the depths. And then it would jump again, a breathtaking display of raw power. Each time it jumped, it tested my resolve, pushing me to my limits. I drank water, ate a bit of a sandwich, and kept fighting. I knew I had to stay hydrated and keep my energy up if I wanted to have any chance of winning this battle. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange connection to the marlin. I respected its strength, its tenacity, its will to survive. I also felt a sense of guilt. I was trying to kill something that was so magnificent, so powerful, so vital to the ocean ecosystem. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to get sentimental. I was in the middle of a fight, and I had to focus on winning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the marlin started to tire. His runs became shorter, his jumps less frequent. I could feel that I was gaining the upper hand. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reel it in, inch by inch. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I kept going. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. As the marlin got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was even bigger than I had imagined. It was a magnificent creature with shimmering silver scales, a long pointed bill, and powerful, graceful fins. When I finally got it close enough to the boat, I reached for my gaff. But then I hesitated. I looked into the marlin's eye, and I saw something there, a kind of ancient wisdom, a quiet understanding of the natural world. In that moment, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't kill this fish. It wasn't about the trophy or the bragging rights or the money. It was about respect, about honoring the life of this incredible creature. So I did something that surprised even myself. I lowered the gaff, reached for my knife, and cut the line. The marlin paused for a moment, as if surprised by my actions. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the depths. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where the marlin had disappeared. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhilaration. I had lost the fight, but I had won something more important. I had honored my own conscience. I reeled in the line, stowed my gear, and started the engine. As I headed back to shore, I couldn't stop smiling. I had a story to tell, a story about the one that got away, a story about respect and the wildness of the sea. Now, the story doesn't quite finish there. When I got back to Biloxi, word about my encounter with the marlin had already spread like wildfire. Fishermen, dock workers, and even some tourists gathered around the sea serpent to hear my tale. They were all amazed by the size of the fish, and they were even more amazed by what I did, or rather what I didn't do. "You cut the line?" one of the fishermen asked, incredulous. "After all that fighting? You must be crazy, Jerry." I just shrugged. "Maybe I am," I said, "but I couldn't do it. It just didn't feel right." Some of them shook their heads, but others nodded in understanding. They knew what it was like to feel a connection to the sea, to respect the creatures that lived there. That night, I went down to the local bar, the Salty Dog, where all the fishermen hung out. As soon as I walked in, everyone started to cheer. "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" they chanted. The owner of the bar, Maggie, a tough old woman who knew her way around a fishing boat, came over and gave me a hug. "You're a legend, Jerry," she said. "You showed them all what it means to be a true fisherman." She bought me a beer, and I sat down at the bar, surrounded by my friends and colleagues. We talked about the marlin, about the fight, about the decision I made. As I sat there listening to their stories and their laughter, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had stayed true to myself, and I had earned the respect of my community. But the real reward came a few weeks later. I was out fishing again, trolling along the same reef where I had encountered the marlin. I was hoping to catch a few king mackerel, but I wasn't expecting much. Suddenly I saw something in the distance, a flash of silver, a swirl of water. It was a marlin, and it was heading straight towards my boat. As it got closer, I could see that it was the same marlin I had fought weeks before. I recognized the distinctive markings on its side, the scars from previous battles. The marlin swam right up to the sea serpent and circled the boat a few times. It looked at me with its big, wise eyes, as if to say thank you. Then, with a graceful flick of its tail, it swam away, disappearing into the depths once again. I sat there for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. I knew that I had been blessed, that I had been given a gift. From that day on, I never looked at fishing the same way again. I still loved the challenge, the excitement, the thrill of the catch. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the beauty and the fragility of the ocean ecosystem. I started practicing catch and release more, and I took greater care to minimize my impact on the environment. And every time I went out to that reef, I always looked for that marlin. I never saw it again, but I knew that it was out there, swimming free, a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the sea. Hope you're ready, because this next story's got a pull to it, just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. The salt hung thick in the air that day, just clinging to you like a second skin. I reckon it was late August, the kind where the sun beats down on the Gulf like a blacksmith's hammer, making the water shimmer and dance. Debbie, bless her heart, was back at the cabin, probably fussing over her begonias and getting ready for the next wave of travelers. I, on the other hand, was out there, me and my trusty boat, the salty dog, chasing the ever-elusive red drum. Now I've hooked a lot of red drum in my time, some real monsters, but this particular day felt different. It felt charged, like the air itself was humming with anticipation. I remember feeling an unusual calmness, a stillness that settled over me, like the morning mist over the bayou. Usually I'd be fidgeting, checking my lines, fussing with my bait, but that day I just let the boat drift, the rhythm of the waves rocking me into a peaceful trance. I wasn't using any fancy gear that day, just my old reliable rod, the one with the slightly worn cork grip, a simple weighted hook, and a chunk of fresh mullet. I've always been a believer in the power of simplicity, letting the fish do the talking, so to speak. Hours passed, and the sun started sinking, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A few smaller fish had nipped at my bait, but nothing of real interest. I was content, though, just enjoying the quiet solitude of the sea. Then it happened. The rod bent over like a willow in a hurricane. Not a sharp, jarring tug, but a slow, powerful pull, like something enormous had decided to explore the depths with my line. My heart jumped into my throat, and that calm I'd been feeling turned into a thrill that ran right down to my toes. I knew, in that instant, this was no ordinary fish. I set the hook, and the fight began, a battle of wills between man and beast that played out under the fading light. This wasn't a quick, erratic fight. It was slow, deliberate, the fish pulling me one way, me giving a little, then taking some line back. It felt like I was wrestling a submerged log, an ancient leviathan that had seen centuries of the ocean's secrets. Sweat beaded on my brow as I fought the fish. My arms ached. My back was screaming, but I couldn't give up. Not now. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. It was about something deeper, something primal. It was about the connection between a fisherman and the sea, a respect for the power that lay beneath the surface. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and I was fighting under the soft glow of the moon. The stars started to appear, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. I couldn't see the fish yet, but I could feel its immense power, its resilience. I started to think I might lose, but something deep inside me wouldn't let me quit. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a flash of silver in the moonlight, then another. I could make out the broad, powerful tail thrashing in the water as the fish broke the surface, its copper scales gleaming. It was the biggest red drum I'd ever seen, a true specimen, easily 70, maybe 80 pounds, maybe more. It looked like it could swallow my smallest dog whole. Slowly, carefully, I began to reel it in, the boat rocking with the strain. It was a delicate dance, a give and take, each movement calculated. I kept a steady hand, knowing that one wrong twitch could snap the line, or worse, break my heart. Finally, after what seemed like days, I managed to get the fish alongside the boat. I could see it clearly now, its big, soulful eye looking back at me. Now some might say I was foolish, but instead of pulling him aboard, something made me pause. I just stared at him, mesmerized. There he was, majestic and strong. I remember thinking about how many years he'd been swimming those currents, witnessing the ever-changing tides. I felt a profound respect for him, a kinship that went beyond the usual fisherman's pride. It was like I was seeing a part of myself reflected in his ancient eyes, a connection to the deeper rhythms of the universe that we all sometimes tend to forget. In that moment, the thrill of the catch faded. I knew that pulling him into the boat, taking him away from his home, just didn't feel right. So I did something I never usually do. I took my knife and carefully cut the line. I watched as the red drum paused for a moment, then, with a flick of its powerful tail, disappeared back into the darkness, sinking into the depths from whence he came. The line went slack, and the silence that followed felt both empty and profound. Now, most of the fellas from the docks would have called me a fool. They might have even laughed. Why would I release a fish like that? I could have bragged about it for years, but I didn't care. The memory of that encounter, that silent understanding between man and fish, was worth more than any trophy I could ever hang above my mantle. I pulled in my line, packed up my gear, and headed back to shore. Debbie was waiting for me, a worried look on her face, but I just smiled and told her, "I caught a big one, Debs, the biggest one I've ever seen." She asked how big in pounds, and I told her. "Oh dear," she said, "that would have been a great feast for the travelers." I just chuckled and said, "But this one, Debs, I'll remember forever." And you know what? I still remember it like it was yesterday. The salt, the sweat, the fight, the gentle release. That's the thing about fishing, friend. It's not just about the catch. It's about the journey. It's about the moments of quiet contemplation, the connection with nature, and sometimes it's about the ones that got away. And that, my friend, is a story I'll carry with me until the day the tide takes me away. Now, how about another glass of tea? All right now, enough waiting around. Let's drop our lines and see where this next story takes us. Well, let me tell you about the summer of the snapper, as me and the boys used to call it. Must have been, Lord, time flies like a hummingbird in a hurricane. Must have been back in, let's see, must have been around 30-something, maybe 34, 35. Still had a full head of hair then, and my back didn't creak like this old porch swing every time I stood up. Yeah, 30-something. That was a hot summer, hot and heavy down here in Louisiana. The kind of heat that sticks to you like a wet shirt and saps the energy right out of you before you even pour your first cup of coffee. The Gulf, though, that was always a little bit cooler, a little bit of a breath of fresh air, even steamy as it could get. That year, the red snapper were running thicker than fleas on a hound dog in July. You could practically walk across the water on their backs, or so it seemed. Every fisherman for miles around was out there chasing them, myself included. I had my boat back then, the Salty Dog, a sturdy old girl she was, built for these waters. Not fancy, mind you, but reliable as the sunrise and twice as ornery when she didn't want to start. Anyway, me and my buddy, Dale. Poor Dale. He's gone on to the big fishing hole in the sky now. We decided we were going to make a killing that summer. Snapper were bringing a good price at the market, and we were both young and, well, maybe a little too full of ourselves. We thought we were the kings of the Gulf, knew everything there was to know about fishing. Youthful arrogance, that's a powerful current, stronger than any tide. We'd head out before sunrise, chugging out past the breakers, further than most folks were willing to go. We knew about a few spots, old reefs and wrecks that held snapper like nobody's business. And we were catching them, oh Lord, were we catching them? Big old beauties, crimson red, fighting like they had a personal vendetta against your fishing rod. Our boat would be loaded down by midday, near sinking sometimes. We packed them in so tight. We were greedy, plain and simple, chasing the money, chasing the glory of the biggest catch, the most fish. We weren't thinking about much else. Not the beauty of the sunrise over the water, not the way the dolphins would play in our wake, not even the simple pleasure of just being out there on the Gulf. Just fish, 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 and more fish. One day, we were out further than usual. Dale had heard tell of a new wreck, way out past the 20-mile mark, supposed to be swarming with snapper the size of dinner plates. Now, usually I was a bit more cautious, stuck closer to what I knew. But Dale, he was always the adventurous one, pushing the boundaries, and the lure of those big snapper, it was too strong to resist. So we went, chugged and chugged further and further out. The water got deeper, darker blue, almost black. We reached the coordinates Dale had, and sure enough, the fish finder lit up like a Christmas tree. Schools of snapper, thick as thieves, all around that wreck. For a while, it was heaven for a fisherman. Drop your line, bam. Fish on. Reel it in. Another big snapper. We were pulling them up one after another. Barely had time to rebait our hooks. The sun beat down. Sweat dripped off our noses. But we didn't care. We were in fishing paradise. But then the wind started to pick up. Just a little breeze at first, nothing much. But then it got stronger and stronger. The sky started to turn a funny color, kind of a bruised purple-gray. I looked to the east, and I saw it, a line of dark clouds, low and angry, coming at us fast. "Dale," I said, "I don't like the look of that." Dale, he was busy hauling in a snapper that must have weighed 10 pounds, all muscle and fight. "Relax, Jerry," he said, grinning. "Just a little squall. We've seen worse." Maybe we had, but something felt different about this one. The air felt heavy, electric almost. The waves were starting to chop up, the boat rocking harder. "Dale, we need to head back," I said, my voice getting a little sharper. "Now." He finally looked up, took a look at the sky, and his grin faded. "Yeah," he said, "maybe you're right." We started to pull up our lines, reel in our gear, but the storm was coming on fast, faster than we could have imagined. By the time we got the anchor up and the Salty Dog pointed back toward shore, the wind hit us full force. It was like a giant hand smacking us sideways, Waves jumped up, big and angry, spraying over the bow, soaking us to the bone in an instant. The sky turned black as pitch, and the rain started. Not a gentle rain, but a torrential downpour, stinging our faces like buckshot. Visibility dropped to nothing. We couldn't see shore, couldn't see anything but the angry gray water and the wall of rain. The salty dog was tossing and turning like a cork in a bathtub. Waves were crashing over the sides, filling the boat with water. The engine was screaming, trying to power us through the storm, but it felt like we were hardly making any headway. Fear, real fear, started to creep into my gut. I'd been in storms before, plenty of them, but nothing like this. This was a monster, a Gulf rage, unleashed. Dale, for all his bravado, was looking pale. "Think we're in trouble, Jerry?" he yelled over the roar of the wind and waves. "We're in deep trouble, Dale," I yelled back. "Deep trouble indeed." We fought. We fought the storm, fought to keep the boat pointed into the waves, fought to keep the engine running, fought to bail out the water that kept pouring in. Years of experience, years of fishing in these waters, that's what saved us. Instinct took over. Every wave, every gust of wind, I reacted, adjusted, fought back. Dale, too. He was a good man in a crisis, no doubt about it. Time lost all meaning. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes, seemed like a lifetime. The storm raged on, relentless, merciless. We were tossed around like toys, battered and bruised, cold and soaked to the bone. I remember thinking more than once, this is it. This is how it ends. Out here in the middle of the Gulf, swallowed by the storm, for chasing after a pile of fish. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it started to ease. The wind began to die down. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The waves started to flatten out. The sky, still dark gray, started to show hints of light peeking through. Slowly, painstakingly, the storm retreated. Like some wild beast, it had roared and raged, and then, just as capriciously, it decided to move on, leaving us battered and shaken in its wake. When the clouds finally broke for good, the sun peeked through, weak and watery, but still the sun. The sea was still rough, choppy, but it wasn't the raging monster it had been. We looked around. We were still afloat. The salty dog was battered, beat up, waterlogged, but she was still riding the waves. We were alive. Beat up, scared half to death, but alive. We didn't say much for a while. Just sat there, exhausted, breathing heavy. The smell of salt and rain thick in the air. We slowly started to take stock. The boat was a mess. Gear tossed everywhere. Some of it washed overboard, I'm sure. The fish, well, all those snapper we'd caught, our bounty, our prize, all washed overboard in the storm. Every single one. We'd lost everything, except we'd gained something too. Something more important than a boatload of fish or a pile of money. We gained a new appreciation, an appreciation for the power of the sea, the unpredictability of nature, and the sheer dumb luck of being alive. Slowly, we limped the salty dog back toward shore. The engine was sputtering and coughing, but it kept running. The trip felt like it took forever. Every wave, every creak of the boat was a reminder of what we'd just been through. We finally made it back to the harbor late that night. The other fishermen were there, waiting, worried sick. They'd seen the storm coming in, and they knew we were way out there. When they saw us pull in, battered but whole, they let out a cheer that echoed across the water. They helped us tie up the salty dog, helped us ashore, offered us food, warm drinks, dry clothes. They didn't ask about the fish, didn't ask about our catch. They just were glad to see us alive. That night, sitting by the fire in the fishing shack, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot coffee, Dale and me, we finally started to talk. Not about the storm itself, not really, but about what it meant, about what we'd learned. You know, Dale said, staring into the flames. We were getting too greedy, Jerry, too focused on the catch, not on the sea itself. I nodded. Yeah, I said. We forgot to respect her. Forgot she's got a temper. We sat there in silence for a while, just listening to the crackle of the fire and the gentle lapping of the waves outside. And then Dale said something that stuck with me, something I've never forgotten. Maybe, he said, maybe the sea, she took our fish to teach us a lesson, to remind us who's really in charge out here. And you know what? I think he was right. That storm, that summer of the snapper storm, it took more than just our fish that day. It took our arrogance. It stripped us bare, showed us just how small and insignificant we really are in the face of nature's power. We went back fishing, of course, Dale and me. We were fishermen. It's in our blood. But something had changed in us. We didn't chase after the biggest catch quite so hard anymore. We paid more attention to the signs of the sea, learned to respect her moods, her rhythms. We appreciated the beauty of the sunrise, the dance of the dolphins, the simple joy of being out there on the water. We still caught fish, plenty of them, but we understood then that the real bounty wasn't just in the fish we brought back to shore. It was in the whole experience, the challenge, the beauty, the danger, the peace. It was in the connection to something bigger than ourselves. So that's my story, son, or ma'am. The summer of the snapper storm. Lost a boatload of fish, almost lost our lives, but gained something more valuable in the process. Learned a lesson about respect, about humility, about the real treasures in life. The sea, she's a hard teacher, but she's a fair one. And sometimes the greatest catches ain't the ones you bring back to shore. Sometimes they're the lessons you learn out there, fighting the storms of life. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, and don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See y'all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.